The stagecoach jolted over another rut in the dusty Kansas road, and Georgiana Elsworth pressed her hand against the window frame to steady herself, watching the endless prairie roll past like waves on an ocean she'd never learned to trust. She'd been running for 3 years now, ever since the fire that took her parents and their Philadelphia home, ever since the creditors came knocking with papers that proved her father's shipping business had been built on borrowed time and broken promises, ever since she realized that staying still meant drowning in memories and debts she could never repay. "Caldwell, next stop," the driver called from above, his voice muffled by the wind and the thundering of hooves. "5 minutes, folks." Georgiana straightened her traveling dress, the dark green fabric now coated with a fine layer of prairie dust despite her best efforts to keep it clean. She'd sewn the dress herself in St. Louis, where she'd spent 6 months working in a milliner's shop before the owner's wife decided she didn't like the way her husband looked at the pretty young seamstress. Before that, it had been Denver, where she'd taught piano to the children of silver miners who struck it rich. Before that, Omaha, where she'd worked as a clerk in a general store until the owner tried to pay her in whiskey and unwanted advances instead of actual money. Each town was the same story with different faces. She'd arrive with hope, find work, start to feel like maybe, just maybe, she could build something resembling a life. Then something would happen. Someone would get too curious about her past or too insistent about her future, and she'd feel that familiar tightening in her chest, that desperate need to keep moving before the walls closed in. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of a weathered building with Caldwell Station painted across its front in fading letters. Georgiana gathered her single carpet bag, the only possession she'd managed to keep through all her travels, and stepped down into the afternoon sun of July, 1883. Caldwell was bigger than she'd expected, with a main street lined with false-fronted buildings that tried to look more substantial than they were. She counted 2 saloons, a general store, what looked like a land office, and a modest church with a white steeple that caught the light. Horses lined the hitching posts, and men in dusty work clothes moved with purpose between buildings. In the distance, she could hear the lowing of cattle, a sound that seemed to form the heartbeat of this place. "You looking for work, miss?" A woman's voice made Georgiana turn. She was perhaps 50, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. "I'm Martha Henderson. My husband runs the general store, and I couldn't help but notice you're traveling alone." "I am," Georgiana said, measuring her words carefully. She'd learned not to volunteer too much information. "I'm hoping to find employment. I can sew, teach, keep books, work in a store." Martha's expression softened with something that might have been pity or recognition. "We get a lot of folks passing through Caldwell. Some stay, most don't. The town's growing, though, on account of the cattle trade. Ranchers bring their herds up from Texas, and we're one of the last stops before they push on north. Makes for steady business. You know of anyone hiring?" Georgiana kept her voice steady, though her stomach had been twisted in knots since breakfast. She had exactly $3.40 to her name. "Well, there's always need for help at the boarding house, or the restaurant might take you on. But if you've got education, you might talk to Reverend Cooper about the school. Our teacher left last month to get married, and we've got near about 20 children with nobody to teach them." Martha paused, studying Georgiana's face. "You running from something, dear, or toward something?" The question hit harder than Georgiana expected. She looked down at her worn boots, the same ones she'd been resoling herself for the past year. "I'm not sure there's a difference anymore." "There's always a difference," Martha said gently. "One leaves you hollow, the other fills you up. You just have to figure out which one you're doing." Before Georgiana could respond, a commotion erupted down the street. A horse had broken free from its hitching post, its reins dragging in the dirt as it bolted toward them. People scattered, shouting warnings. Georgiana stood frozen, her carpetbag clutched to her chest, as the animal bore down on her with wild eyes and flaring nostrils. Then, a man moved faster than should have been possible, appearing seemingly from nowhere. He caught the horse's bridle with strong, sure hands, speaking in a low, steady voice that Georgiana couldn't quite make out over the pounding of her own heart. The horse calmed almost instantly, its panic subsiding under the man's touch and voice. "Easy now, easy," he murmured, running a hand down the horse's neck. "Nobody's going to hurt you. Just got spooked, didn't you?" He was tall, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of the sky just before a storm. His clothes marked him as a working rancher, worn denim, and a shirt that had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended. When he finally looked up and met Georgiana's gaze, she felt something shift in her chest, something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the quiet strength she saw in his face. "You all right, madam?" His voice was deeper than she'd expected, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas roots. "Yes, thank you." She found her voice, though it came out breathier than she'd intended. "That was quite impressive." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just used to working with horses. They're like people, mostly just scared and trying to make sense of a world that doesn't always make sense to them." He secured the horse to a nearby post, then turned back to her. "I'm Jacob Vance. I run a ranch about 5 miles outside of town. Georgiana Elsworth." She extended her hand without thinking, and he took it carefully, his palm rough with calluses but his touch surprisingly gentle. "You just arrived?" He glanced at her carpetbag. "Yes, I'm looking for work, actually. Mrs. Henderson was just telling me about a teaching position." Something flickered across Jacob's face, an expression she couldn't quite read. "The school's a good place. The children need someone who'll stick around, though. Last 3 teachers didn't make it through a full year." There was no judgment in his tone, but Georgiana felt defensive anyway. "I'm very capable of fulfilling a teaching contract, Mr. Vance. Didn't say you weren't." He tipped his hat. "Just meant that life out here isn't easy for people who aren't used to it. Winters are hard, and Caldwell can feel pretty isolated when the wind starts blowing cold across those plains." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Georgiana said, lifting her chin. "Or isolation." Jacob studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her careful defenses to the rootless, restless person underneath. "No, I don't suppose you are. But there's a difference between not being afraid of something and actually wanting it. Have a good day, Miss Elsworth. Welcome to Caldwell." He walked away before she could respond, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. Georgiana watched him go, annoyed at herself for caring what a stranger thought of her, more annoyed that his words had struck so close to the truth she'd been avoiding for 3 years. "That's Jacob Vance," Martha said softly beside her. Georgiana had almost forgotten the older woman was there. "Good man. Lost his wife in childbirth 4 years back, lost the baby too. Threw himself into building up his ranch after that. He's got the biggest spread in the county now, but folks worry he works himself too hard. Lonely life, I think, though he'd never admit it." Georgiana felt a pang of sympathy, then pushed it away. She didn't have room in her life for sympathy or connections or anything that might make her want to stay when the inevitable urge to run came again. "Where would I find Reverend Cooper?" Martha pointed toward the church. "He's usually there this time of day. Tell him I sent you. And Georgiana, sometimes the thing we're running from catches up with us no matter how far we go. Sometimes we have to stop and face it." "I'll keep that in mind," Georgiana said, though she had no intention of stopping, not really. She'd take the teaching job if they offered it, save enough money for the next leg of her journey, then move on before anyone got close enough to ask questions she didn't want to answer. Reverend Cooper turned out to be a slight man with spectacles and an earnest manner that reminded Georgiana of her father in better days. He interviewed her in the small room behind the church that served as his office, asking about her education and experience. She told him the truth, mostly, about teaching in Denver and her work in various shops and offices. She didn't mention why she'd left each place, and he was kind enough or desperate enough not to press. The position pays $30 a month, plus room and board, he explained. We have a small teacher's cottage behind the school. It's not much, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it's clean and the stove works well. School runs from September through May, but if you're willing to start now, you could use August to prepare and meet some of the families. $30 a month was more than she'd made anywhere else, and having her own cottage meant independence, meant not having to navigate the politics of boarding houses or navigate unwanted advances from landlords. "I'll take it," she said, before she could think too hard about what staying in one place for nearly a year might mean. Reverend Cooper's face broke into a relieved smile. "Wonderful. Let me show you the school and the cottage. I think you'll find Caldwell a fine place to settle, Miss Elsworth. We're a community that takes care of our own." The school was a single room with wooden benches serving as desks, a blackboard at the front, and windows that let in the prairie light. The teacher's cottage sat just beyond, connected by a worn path through the grass. It was indeed small, but it was clean and private, with a narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a stove that looked like it had been recently repaired. "Martha Henderson organized some of the ladies to stock the pantry for you," Reverend Cooper said, opening cupboards to reveal flour, sugar, coffee, and various other supplies. "And there's a well just outside. We take care of our teacher here." Georgiana felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. It had been so long since anyone had taken care of her, since she'd let anyone try. "Thank you," she managed. "Please thank Mrs. Henderson and the others as well. You can thank them yourself at church on Sunday. The whole town will want to meet you." He paused at the door. "I hope you'll be happy here, Miss Elsworth. I have a feeling Caldwell might surprise you." After he left, Georgiana sat at the small table and let herself feel the weight of what she'd just done. A year in one place. A year of teaching children, of becoming part of a community, of letting people know her name and her face and maybe even her story. The familiar panic started to rise in her chest, but she forced it down with the practice of someone who'd been fighting the same battle for years. She could do this. She would save money, keep to herself as much as possible, and when the year was up, she'd have enough to move on to somewhere bigger, somewhere she could disappear into the crowd. San Francisco, maybe, or even back east where no one would know her anymore. The plan made sense. It was logical, practical, safe. So why did it make her feel so impossibly tired? The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Georgiana cleaned the schoolhouse, organized the handful of books they had, and met with some of the mothers who brought their children by to introduce themselves. The children were curious and energetic, ranging in age from 6 to 14, with the mix of backgrounds she'd expected in a frontier town like this. Some were the children of shopkeepers and professionals. Others came from the surrounding ranches and farms. She didn't see Jacob Vance again, though she heard his name mentioned several times. His ranch, the Double V, was apparently the most successful in the area, and he employed several ranch hands and a foreman. People spoke of him with respect, though Martha had been right about the concern in their voices. He worked too hard, they said. Needed a wife, needed to think about more than just cattle and horses. Georgiana told herself She wasn't interested in the town gossip about a rancher she'd met once for 5 minutes. She had her own life to worry about. Sunday came bright and hot, with a wind that made the prairie grass ripple like water. Georgiana dressed in her best dress, a deep blue cotton she'd made in Denver, and walked to the church with her hair pinned in a careful bun. She'd learned long ago that first impressions mattered, especially for a single woman trying to establish herself in a new place. The church was nearly full when she arrived, families clustered together in the pews, children squirming in their Sunday clothes. Martha Henderson waved her over to sit with them, and Georgiana gratefully accepted, relieved not to sit alone under the curious stares of the entire congregation. The service was simple and earnest, Reverend Cooper's sermon about finding home in faith rather than place. Georgiana tried not to read too much into the timing. Afterward, what seemed like the entire town lined up to introduce themselves and welcome her to Caldwell. There was the doctor, Samuel Wright, and his wife Helen, the owner of the general store, Martha's husband Edward, the saloon keeper, surprisingly refined and friendly, the blacksmith, the land agent, the owner of the boarding house. And then Jacob Vance, standing slightly apart from the crowd, his hat in his hands, and his foreman, a grizzled man named Pete, beside him. "Miss Elsworth," Jacob said with a nod. "I hear you're our new teacher." "I am." She kept her voice polite but distant. "School starts in 3 weeks." "That's good. Real good for the town." He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes. "I wanted to apologize if I came across harsh when we first met. I didn't mean to suggest you weren't capable." The apology surprised her. Most men she'd met out here wouldn't have bothered. "No offense taken, Mr. Vance." "Jacob, please." He met her eyes, and again she felt that strange jolt of recognition, like looking in a mirror and seeing someone else's loneliness reflected back at you. "I hope Caldwell treats you well." "I'm sure it will," she said, then added before she could stop herself, "Do you have children who'll be attending the school?" Pain flashed across his face there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "No, no children." She remembered what Martha had said about his wife and baby and felt like she'd kicked a wounded animal. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean, nothing to be sorry for. It's a reasonable question for a teacher to ask." He settled his hat back on his head. "I should get back to the ranch." "Good day, Miss Elsworth." He was gone before she could say anything else, striding toward his horse with Pete hurrying to keep up. Georgiana watched him go, feeling oddly bereft, like she'd just lost something she never had to begin with. "Don't mind Jacob," Martha said quietly beside her. "He's got walls built up so high, sometimes I wonder if even he can see over them anymore." "I wasn't minding anything," Georgiana said, too quickly to be convincing. "I barely know the man." Martha gave her a knowing look but didn't push. "Come by the store tomorrow. Edward and I would love to have you for dinner sometime this week. Help you settle in proper." Georgiana agreed, grateful for the kindness, wary of accepting too much of it. She'd learned that kindness came with expectations, with connections that became chains when you needed to leave. But as she walked back to her cottage in the afternoon heat, she couldn't stop thinking about Jacob Vance's eyes when she'd asked about children, about the careful way he held himself like a man expecting pain, about the loneliness Martha had mentioned. She recognized it because she carried the same loneliness in her own chest, the kind that came from never letting anyone close enough to hurt you, from always keeping one foot pointed toward the door. August passed in a golden haze of preparation and prairie heat. Georgiana threw herself into getting ready for school, grateful for work that kept her hands and mind busy. She met more of the families, learned the names of all her future students, and started to understand the rhythm of life in Caldwell. The town existed primarily because of the cattle trade. with ranchers from Texas driving their herds north to the railroads in Kansas. The ranchers who actually lived in the area, like Jacob Vance, were building something more permanent, raising cattle and horses, establishing spreads that might last for generations. She saw Jacob twice more during that month, both times from a distance. Once he was in town buying supplies, loading bags of grain into a wagon with efficient, practiced movements. Another time she'd taken a walk out beyond the edge of town and spotted him on horseback in the distance, riding along the fence line of what she assumed was his property. Each time she felt that same pull of curiosity, that same sense of recognition. And each time she reminded herself that curiosity was dangerous, that connection was dangerous, that the only safe path was the one that kept moving. School started on the first Monday of September with 22 students ranging from 6-year-old twins who could barely sit still to 14-year-old Thomas Henderson, Martha and Edward's grandson, who clearly thought he was too old for school but had been firmly instructed to attend. Georgiana quickly established rules and routines, dividing the students into groups by age and ability, rotating between teaching reading to the youngest and history to the oldest while the middle groups worked on arithmetic and writing. It was exhausting work, but it was good work, the kind that left her tired in body but satisfied in spirit. The children were eager to learn, mostly well-behaved and openly curious about their new teacher. They asked her questions she deflected with practiced skill. Where was she from? Back east. Did she have family? Not anymore. Would she stay in Caldwell? We'll see. 3 weeks into the school year, on a Friday afternoon when the September heat still hung heavy over the prairie, a rider came thundering into town. Georgiana heard the commotion from the schoolhouse and dismissed the children early, following them out to see what was happening. A young ranch hand she didn't recognize was talking urgently to the doctor while a crowd gathered. Georgiana caught fragments of the conversation. Accident. Fence repair, pinned under a post. The Double V Jacobs Ranch. Her heart dropped before her mind could catch up. She pushed through the crowd as Dr. Wright grabbed his medical bag and headed for his horse. "Is it Mr. Vance?" she heard herself asking. "Is he hurt?" The doctor glanced at her, surprised. "Yes, sounds serious. I need to get out there." "I'm coming with you." The words were out before she could think about them, before she could remember that caring was dangerous, that involvement was something she'd sworn to avoid. "Miss Elsworth, I don't think I can help. I've assisted with injuries before." It was true, sort of. She'd helped her mother tend to servants who'd been hurt in household accidents. It wasn't the same as a ranch injury, but Dr. Wright looked harried enough not to argue. "Fine. Can you ride?" "Well enough." Another truth stretched thin. She'd ridden in Philadelphia, proper English saddle rides in the park. It probably wasn't the same as riding a Western horse, but she'd figure it out. 10 minutes later, she was bouncing uncomfortably in a saddle on a borrowed horse, following Dr. Wright as he pushed his mount to a pace that made her teeth rattle. The 5 miles to the Double V felt like 50, the prairie flying past in a blur of grass and sky. The ranch house came into view, a solid structure of wood and stone that spoke of permanence and care. Beyond it were barns, corrals, and dozens of cattle grazing in fenced pastures. Ranch hands were gathered near one of the barns, and as they rode closer, Georgiana could see Jacob lying on the ground, a massive fence post beside him and his foreman Pete kneeling next to him. Dr. Wright dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. Georgiana climbed down more carefully, her legs shaking from the ride and something deeper, something that felt like fear but more personal. "How bad is it?" Dr. Wright was already examining Jacob, his hands moving with professional efficiency. "Post fell when the support gave way," Pete said, his weathered face creased with worry. Caught him across the ribs. He was conscious at first, but he's been out for about 10 minutes now. Georgiana moved closer, her medical knowledge evaporating in the face of seeing Jacob so still, his face pale beneath the tan, blood staining his shirt. She knelt on his other side without thinking, her hand finding his and squeezing, as if she could somehow anchor him to consciousness through touch alone. "Jacob," she said softly. "Jacob, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered. Slowly, painfully, his eyes opened and found hers. For a moment, confusion clouded his expression, then something that might have been surprise or relief or both. "Miss Elsworth," he managed, his voice rough. "What are you doing here?" "Apparently making poor life choices," she said, trying for lightness while her heart hammered against her ribs. "Hold still. Dr. Wright needs to examine you." "I'm fine." Jacob tried to sit up and immediately gasped, his face going even paler. "You're not fine," Dr. Wright said firmly. "You've got at least 2 broken ribs, possibly more, and I need to check for internal injuries. Stop being stubborn and let me work." Over the next hour, Georgiana did what she could to help, which mostly meant holding instruments, fetching water, and keeping Jacob still when the pain made him try to move. Dr. Wright's examination revealed 3 broken ribs, but, miraculously, no apparent internal bleeding or organ damage. "You're lucky," the doctor said as he wrapped Jacob's ribs in tight bandages. "This could have been much worse, but you'll need to stay still for at least a month. No riding, no working, no lifting anything heavier than a fork. Those ribs need time to heal properly." "A month?" Jacob looked horrified. "Doc, I've got a ranch to run. It's only September. I've got cattle to move, repairs to finish before winter, a dozen things that can't wait a month." "They'll have to wait," Dr. Wright said firmly. "Or you can ignore me, puncture a lung, and die, your choice." Pete stepped forward. "Don't worry, boss. Me and the boys can handle things. You just focus on healing up." Jacob looked like he wanted to argue, but another wave of pain crossed his face and he closed his eyes, breathing shallowly. His hand tightened around Georgiana's, and she realized she'd been holding it this entire time. "He shouldn't be alone, Doctor," Wright said, washing his hands in a basin one of the ranch hands brought. "Not for the first few days, at least. If he starts showing signs of internal bleeding, he'll need immediate help." "I'll stay," Pete said immediately. "You need to run the ranch," Jacob said, opening his eyes again. "You can't do that if you're hovering over me like a mother hen." "Then we'll hire someone," Pete insisted. "One of the women from town, maybe." "I'll stay." The words came out of Georgiana's mouth before her brain could veto them. "I can stay for a few days at least. School's only in session until 3, and it's not far to ride back and forth." Everyone turned to stare at her. She felt heat creep up her neck, felt the weight of impropriety and social expectations, and all the reasons why a single schoolteacher absolutely should not stay at the ranch of a single man, even an injured one. "That's not appropriate," Jacob said, his voice strained. "You can't risk your reputation." "I don't much care about my reputation," Georgiana said, and realized it was true. What did reputation matter when you were always planning to leave anyway? "Dr. Wright, would my staying here be medically helpful?" The doctor hesitated, clearly weighing medical necessity against social propriety. "It would. I'd feel better knowing someone with sense was here to watch for complications. But Miss Elsworth, you understand the talk this might cause. Let them talk." She looked at Jacob, at the pain and stubbornness fighting for dominance in his expression. "Unless you have objections, Mr. Vance," Jacob, he said quietly. "If you're going to stay in my house, you should call me Jacob." "Then, unless you have objections, Jacob." He studied her for a long moment, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes. Pride battling need, propriety battling practicality. Finally, he sighed, wincing at the movement. "I'd be grateful for your help, Georgiana." The sound of her name in his low voice did something strange to her stomach, something she firmly ignored. Then it settled. "Pete, can you or one of the hands ride back to town and let Reverend Cooper know I'll be teaching half-days for the next week? The older students can help the younger ones with their afternoon lessons." Over the next 2 hours, a flurry of activity transformed the ranch house to accommodate the unexpected arrangement. The house itself was larger than Georgiana had expected, with a main room dominated by a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a cast iron stove that looked well used, and 3 bedrooms. Jacob's room was on the main floor, while 2 smaller rooms upstairs had apparently once been intended for children who never came. The hands helped Jacob into his bed, a large piece of furniture that looked handmade, with a thick quilt that showed evidence of careful stitching. A woman's touch, Georgiana thought, and felt an unexpected pang thinking about the wife who died here, who'd never seen her children grow up in those rooms upstairs. "There's supplies in the kitchen," Pete told her as the ranch hands filed out, heading back to work with worried glances toward their boss. "Jacob keeps it pretty well stocked. I'll have one of the boys bring fresh water up to the house morning and evening, and if you need anything, just ring the bell by the door. Someone will hear it." After they left, Georgiana stood in the main room of Jacob's house and felt the full weight of what she'd just done. She was in a man's home. She'd agreed to stay here to care for him, to let herself become involved in his life in a way she'd specifically been avoiding since she arrived in Caldwell. What was she thinking? From the bedroom, she heard Jacob cough, then groan with pain. The sound erased her doubts, or at least buried them beneath more immediate concerns. She found him trying to reach for the water glass on the bedside table, his face gray with pain and frustration. "Let me." She crossed to him quickly, lifting the glass to his lips and supporting his head while he drank. His hair was damp with sweat, and this close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, marks of sun and worry and years of working this harsh land. "Thank you," he said when he'd had enough. She lowered his head back to the pillow, acutely aware of the intimacy of the gesture, of how vulnerable he was in this moment. "You should try to sleep," she said. "Dr. Wright left laudanum if the pain gets too bad." "I hate laudanum. Makes me foggy." His eyes were already drifting closed though, his body surrendering to exhaustion and trauma. "Georgiana." "Yes. Why did you really come? Why do you care?" The question caught her off guard with its directness. She looked at his face, peaceful now as sleep started to claim him, and felt something crack in the careful walls she'd built around her heart. "I don't know," she whispered. "I really don't know." But as she pulled a chair next to his bed and settled in to keep watch, she knew that was a lie. She cared because somewhere in the brief moments they'd shared, she'd recognized something in Jacob Vance that mirrored what she carried in herself. Loneliness. Loss. The exhaustion that came from always being strong, always being self-sufficient, always refusing to need anyone. She cared because for the first time in 3 years she wanted to stop running, and that terrified her more than any fence post or broken ribs ever could. The first night was long. Jacob drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes peaceful, sometimes restless with pain. Each time he stirred, Georgiana was there, helping him drink water, adjusting his pillows, speaking in low, soothing tones that seemed to calm him even when he wasn't fully conscious. Around midnight, he woke more fully, his eyes finding her in the dim light from the lamp she'd turned low. "You're still here," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Where else would I be?" She set down the book she'd been pretending to read. "In town, in your own bed, anywhere but watching a broken rancher sleep." Dr. Wright said you shouldn't be alone. That's not what I meant. He shifted carefully, trying to find a more comfortable position. You don't strike me as someone who makes decisions based on what other people say you should do. I'm not, she admitted. Usually. So why stay? She should have deflected, should have given some practical answer about duty or medical necessity. Instead, she found herself saying, "When I first arrived in Caldwell, I told myself I'd save my money and move on within a year. I've been telling myself that for 3 years now in 3 different towns. I'm tired, Jacob. I'm tired of running and tired of pretending I'm not running. When I heard you were hurt, I stopped thinking about what I should do and just did what I wanted to do. I wanted to help. I wanted to be here." The confession hung in the air between them, more intimate than the dim bedroom, more vulnerable than she'd been with anyone since her parents died. "What are you running from?" His voice was gentle without judgment. "Everything. Nothing. Myself, mostly." She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "My parents died when I was 20. Our house burned down with them in it. Afterward, I found out my father's business was bankrupt, built on debts he'd been hiding from everyone, including my mother. The creditors took everything. I had nothing, no money, no family, no home. So I left Philadelphia and I just kept leaving every place I ended up. I keep thinking if I move far enough or fast enough, I'll outrun the feeling that I don't belong anywhere. And has it worked? No." The word came out as barely a whisper. "It just gets lonelier." Jacob reached out slowly, his hand finding hers in the lamplight. "After Mary died, after the baby, I tried to outwork the grief. I thought if I built this ranch big enough, made it successful enough, I could fill the emptiness. But emptiness doesn't fill from the outside. It just grows to match whatever space you give it." His words struck her like a physical blow, so true they hurt. "What do we do then? How do we stop?" "I don't know." His thumb traced circles on her palm, a gesture that felt both comforting and charged with something else, something neither of them was quite ready to name. "But maybe we could figure it out together." Georgiana's breath caught. Together. The word implied staying, implied connection, implied all the things she'd been running from. It should have sent her bolting for the door. Instead, she tightened her hand around his and said, "Maybe we could." They sat like that for a long time, hands linked in the quiet darkness. Two people who'd forgotten how to be anything but alone, starting to remember that they didn't have to be. The next morning, Georgiana woke in the chair beside Jacob's bed with a crick in her neck and sunlight streaming through the window. Jacob was still sleeping, his breathing even and deep, his face more peaceful than she'd seen it. She stood carefully, stretching out the kinks, and went to explore the kitchen properly. Someone, probably Pete or one of the hands, had already brought fresh water and milk. The pantry was indeed well stocked, and Georgiana set about making breakfast. She found eggs in the cold cellar, bread that was only a day old, bacon wrapped in cloth. The stove was similar to the one in her cottage, and soon she had coffee brewing and bacon sizzling. "That smells incredible." She turned to find Jacob standing in the doorway to his room, one hand braced against the frame, his face tight with pain from the effort of getting up. "You should be in bed," she scolded, moving quickly to his side. "I can't stay in bed for a month. I'll go crazy." But he let her help him to one of the chairs at the kitchen table, lowering himself down with a groan. "Dr. Wright said, I know what the doctor said. I'm not going to work or ride, but I can sit at my own table and eat breakfast like a civilized person." He looked up at her, a hint of his earlier humor back in his eyes. "Besides, I wanted to make sure last night actually happened, that I didn't dream the whole conversation." Heat crept up Georgiana's neck. "It happened." "Good." He accepted the coffee she poured him, cupping the mug carefully. Because I'd like to keep talking if you're willing. When was the last time you had a real conversation with someone, Georgiana? Not small talk or pleasantries, but actual talking. She thought about it as she plated their breakfast. 3 years. The night before my parents died, I had dinner with them. We talked about my father's business, about my mother's garden, about whether I might marry the son of one of my father's associates. It was normal and boring, and I was annoyed because I wanted to go meet my friends instead. I'd give anything to have that boring dinner back. I understand. Jacob picked at his food, clearly hungry but the ribs making eating difficult. Mary and I had a fight the day before she went into labor. Something stupid about fence posts, I think. I was frustrated about work and took it out on her. The last words I said to my wife were spoken in anger. I'd give anything to take that back. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the weight of their shared grief and regret sitting between them but not crushing them, not with someone else who understood. "Tell me about Mary," Georgiana said finally. "If you want to." Jacob's face softened. "She was a good woman. Strong, practical, patient with my moods. We met at a church social in Texas, married young, came up here together to start the ranch. She worked as hard as any of the hands, never complained about the isolation or the hard living. When she got pregnant, she was so happy. We both were." His voice dropped. The labor went on too long. Dr. Wright did everything he could, but there was bleeding he couldn't stop. She lived long enough to hold our daughter for a few minutes. The baby died an hour later. I buried them together in the plot beyond the east pasture. Tears stung Georgiana's eyes. "I'm so sorry, Jacob. It was 4 years ago. Some days it feels like yesterday, other days like a different lifetime." He met her gaze. "I don't talk about her much. People get uncomfortable or they try to push me toward courting again, tell me I need to move on. But you can't move on from someone who shaped who you are. You can only learn to carry the loss differently." "That's exactly it," Georgiana said, feeling understood in a way she hadn't in years. "Everyone kept telling me to move on, to put the past behind me. But the past isn't behind me. It's part of me. I just haven't figured out how to carry it without letting it crush me. Maybe that's something else we could figure out together." There was that word again. Together. Georgiana felt herself leaning toward him, toward the possibility of stopping and staying and letting someone know her. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was interrupted by a knock at the door. Pete stuck his head in, looking apologetic. "Sorry to bother, boss, but we've got a situation with the fence line on the north pasture. Storm last night knocked down about 20 yards of posts. I can handle it, but I wanted to let you know." Jacob started to stand, then gasped and sat back down hard. "How many cattle got out?" "None yet, but if we don't fix it quick, they will. Take Jim and Frank. Use the posts we've got stacked by the barn. Reinforce the weak sections on either side while you're at it." Jacob rattled off instructions with the confidence of a man who knew his land and his work, even if his body couldn't currently do it. After Pete left, Jacob slumped in his chair, frustration evident. "This is going to be the longest month of my life. You need to heal," Georgiana said firmly. "The ranch will survive. You've got good men working for you, I know. I just hate feeling useless." An idea struck her. What if you're not useless? What if you're just working differently? You can't ride out and fix fences, but you can plan and direct and manage. You could have the hands report to you here, go over the books, plan for winter. All the things you probably neglect when you're working yourself to exhaustion in the fields. Jacob looked at her with something like wonder. "That's actually a good idea. I'm occasionally useful for more than teaching children their letters," she said dryly. "I'm starting to see that." His expression turned serious. "I meant what I said last night, Georgiana, about figuring things out together. I know you've been planning to leave and I don't want to pressure you or assume anything, but I'd like you to consider staying. Not for a year, not as a temporary stop on your way somewhere else. Really staying. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Jacob, we barely know each other. I know. But I know enough to recognize that you understand things about me that most people don't. And I think maybe I understand some things about you too. We're both running from different things, both trying to outrun our own loneliness. Maybe we could stop running in the same place. I don't know if I can. Staying still, it scares me more than anything. What's the worst that could happen if you stay? She thought about it, really thought about it for the first time. I could start to care about this place, these people, about you. And then something could happen, could take it all away, and I'd have to feel that loss all over again. That could happen, Jacob agreed. Or you could spend the rest of your life running from the possibility of loss and lose everything that makes life worth living in the process. Love, home, connection, all of it. That's not living, Georgiana. That's just existing. His words hit like stones thrown at glass, cracking something she'd built carefully around her heart. When did you get so wise? When I spent 4 years existing instead of living and realized I was wasting the life Mary died giving me. He reached for her hand again. I'm not saying I have all the answers. I'm not even saying this between us will work out, but I am saying I'd like to try. I'd like to see what happens if two people who are tired of being alone stop being alone together. Georgiana looked at their joined hands, at the calluses on his palm from years of hard work, at the strength in his fingers despite the injury that had temporarily laid him low. She thought about the past 3 years of running, of never staying long enough to build anything real, of the crushing loneliness that had become her constant companion. And she thought about the past 24 hours, about how natural it had felt to stay by his side, to care for him, to open up in ways she'd sworn she never would again. Maybe Jacob was right. Maybe existing wasn't enough anymore. Okay, she whispered. Let's try. The smile that broke across Jacob's face was like sunrise, warm and full of promise. Yeah, but I'm not making any promises about forever. I'm just promising to try not to run, at least not right away. That's all I'm asking. He squeezed her hand. We'll take it slow. Figure things out as we go. While you're supposed to be healing and I'm supposed to be teaching school, this should be interesting. Life with you probably always will be. Jacob's expression turned soft. Thank you, Georgiana, for staying that first time, for staying now. For giving us a chance. She wanted to deflect, to make a joke, to protect herself from the vulnerability of the moment. Instead, she did something brave. She let herself feel it, let herself sit in the scary, exhilarating possibility that maybe, just maybe, she'd found someone worth staying for. You're welcome, she said simply. They spent the rest of that morning talking, really talking, the kind of conversation that meandered from topic to topic without agenda, just two people learning each other's stories. Jacob told her about growing up in Texas, about deciding to move north to Kansas to build something of his own, about the early years of the ranch when it was just him and Mary and a dream. Georgiana told him about Philadelphia, about her father's shipping business and her mother's love of literature, about piano lessons and social calls, and a life that felt like it belonged to someone else now. Around noon, she insisted Jacob rest while she rode back to town for the afternoon teaching session. The students were curious about her morning absence, but she kept her explanations vague. She was helping with a medical situation. She'd be teaching half days for a while. They adapted quickly the way children do, and the older students stepped up to help with the younger ones. Martha cornered her after school. I heard you've been staying at the Double V with Jacob Vance. Here it was, the judgment and social consequences she'd expected. Georgiana lifted her chin. Dr. Wright requested someone stay with him to watch for complications from his injury. I volunteered. Good for you, Martha said, surprising her completely. Jacob's a good man who's been alone too long, and you're a good woman who's been running too long. Maybe you two are exactly what each other needs. Martha, I'm just helping him recover. Sure you are, Martha's eyes twinkled. And I'm the Queen of England. But seriously, dear, don't let gossip or propriety stop you from something real. Life's too short and too hard out here. You grab happiness where you find it. The words stayed with Georgiana as she rode back to the ranch that evening. The sun was setting, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber, and for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she let herself notice the beauty of where she was instead of focusing on where she was going next. The ranch looked different in the evening light, more like a home than just a place. Smoke curled from the bunkhouse chimney where the hands were probably preparing dinner. A few cattle grazed in the near pasture, dark shapes against the golden grass. And in the house, lamplight glowed in the windows, a beacon of warmth against the coming night. Inside, she found Jacob at the kitchen table with ledgers spread in front of him, his forehead creased in concentration. He looked up when she entered, and the smile that crossed his face made her stomach flip. How was school? Good. The children asked about you. Several of them know the ranch hands and heard about your accident. She set her bag down and moved to the stove, where a pot of stew simmered. Did you make this? Pete brought it over, said his mother's recipe. I had some earlier. It's good. They fell into an easy routine over dinner, talking about their respective days. Jacob sharing the updates Pete had given him about the ranch work. Georgiana describing the progress her students were making. It felt domestic in a way that should have scared her but somehow didn't. After dinner, they moved to the main room where the fireplace pushed back the evening chill. Georgiana sat in one of the chairs while Jacob settled carefully on the sofa, his ribs still clearly paining him but his movement getting slightly easier. "Read to me," he asked, nodding toward a shelf of books against the wall. Georgiana selected a volume of poetry, Robert Browning, and began to read aloud. Her voice filled the room, the words painting pictures of love and loss and longing. She glanced up occasionally to find Jacob watching her with an intensity that made her stumble over the verses. "You have a beautiful voice," he said when she paused between poems. "Thank you. My mother used to say I should have been on the stage. Why weren't you?" "That wasn't the life my father wanted for me. He wanted me to marry well, have children, run a household. The safe, respectable path." She closed the book. "I wonder sometimes what he'd think of me now. Teaching in a frontier town, staying at a rancher's house, throwing aside every rule of propriety he raised me with. I think if he loved you, he'd want you to be happy. The rest is just details." Georgiana felt her throat tighten. "I miss them. Even knowing about the debts and the lies, I still miss them every day. Come here." Jacob patted the sofa beside him. She hesitated only a moment before moving to sit next to him, careful not to jostle his ribs. He put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close, and she let herself lean into his warmth and solidity. "It's okay to miss them," he said softly. "It's okay to be angry at them too, for the position they left you in. Both things can be true at once." The permission to feel both things, to hold contradictions without choosing sides, released something in Georgiana's chest. She turned her face into Jacob's shoulder and let herself cry for the first time in 3 years, mourning not just her parents but the life she'd lost, the girl she'd been, the years she'd spent running from her own grief. Jacob held her through it all, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring soft words of comfort. When the tears finally slowed, she pulled back, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to fall apart on you. Don't apologize. I'm honored you trusted me with it." He brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, the gesture achingly tender. "You've been strong for so long, Georgiana. You're allowed to let someone else be strong for you sometimes." She looked into his eyes, those storm sky eyes that saw through her defenses to the frightened, lonely person underneath, and felt something shift permanently in her chest. This was it, the moment she'd been running from. The moment she let someone matter, really matter. "I'm falling for you," she whispered, "and it terrifies me." "Good." His smile was soft, understanding. "I'm falling for you too, and I'm just as terrified. Let's be terrified together." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, but Georgiana didn't want to pull away. She wanted to lean in, to close the distance, to feel his lips against hers. The kiss was gentle, careful of his injuries, but it still managed to feel like coming home and leaping off a cliff all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing harder, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said. "Not just until I'm healed. Really stay. Build a life here with me in Caldwell." "What are you asking?" Her heart was racing, hope and fear warring in her chest. "I'm asking if you'll court me proper. I'm asking if you'll give Caldwell a real chance instead of planning your exit. I'm asking if maybe, eventually, when we're both ready, you'll consider making this ranch your home." He pulled back to look at her directly. "I'm not proposing. Not yet. We've got time to figure each other out, but I want you to know my intentions. I'm looking for forever, Georgiana. If that's not what you want, tell me now. Forever." The word that used to make her want to run now made her want to stay. She thought about the cottage behind the school, about the students who were starting to depend on her, about Martha's kindness, and the way the prairie looked in the sunset, about Jacob's steady strength and understanding eyes. She thought about how tired she was of running. "I want to try," she said carefully. "I want to give forever a real chance. But Jacob, you need to understand I'm still learning how to do this. How to stay, how to trust, how to believe good things won't be ripped away. I might panic. I might get scared and want to run." "Then you tell me when you're scared and we'll work through it, together." He kissed her forehead. "I'm not going anywhere, Georgiana. Even if you run, even if you get scared, I'll be right here waiting for you to come back." The promise, the steadiness of it, the absolute certainty in his voice wrapped around Georgiana like a warm blanket. "You might regret that. I don't think I will." They sat together as the fire burned low, talking in fits and starts, sometimes lapsing into comfortable silence, learning the rhythm of each other's presence. At some point, Georgiana dozed off against Jacob's shoulder, exhausted from the emotional upheaval of the day. She woke to Jacob carefully extracting himself from her, his face tight with pain from the movement. "I need to get to bed," he said apologetically. "These ribs are reminding me I'm supposed to be resting." Georgiana helped him to his room, steadying him when the pain made him stumble. Once he was settled, she stood awkwardly in the doorway, unsure of the boundaries now that everything between them had shifted. "The guest room upstairs has clean sheets," Jacob said, reading her uncertainty. "Unless you'd rather go back to your cottage." "I should stay in case you need something during the night. That's the only reason." His eyes held a hint of teasing despite the pain. "Maybe not the only reason," she admitted. "I'll see you in the morning. Georgiana," she paused at the door, "thank you for everything. For staying, for crying, for being brave enough to give us a chance. Thank you for being someone worth being brave for," she said softly, then headed upstairs before she could do something impulsive like crawl into bed beside him. Propriety and his broken ribs be damned. The next few weeks fell into a pattern that surprised Georgiana with its easiness. She spent mornings and early afternoons teaching, then rode out to the ranch to spend evenings with Jacob. As his ribs healed, he was able to move more freely, and they spent long hours talking, reading, playing chess on an old board he'd found in a trunk. The hands got used to seeing her horse tied up at the house, and Pete took to bringing extra food from town without comment. They talked about everything and nothing. Jacob told her about building the ranch, about his dreams for expanding the herd, about wanting to someday breed horses as well as cattle. Georgiana told him about books she'd loved, music she missed playing, her mother's garden in Philadelphia where roses grew tall against a brick wall. They also talked about harder things, the debts that had destroyed Georgiana's family, the complicated feelings about her father's deception. The wife and daughter Jacob had lost, the fear of loving again and losing again. Through it all, they grew closer, learning each other's moods and habits, starting to anticipate needs and reactions. Jacob learned that Georgiana needed space when she got overwhelmed, that she'd take long walks in the evening to think. Georgiana learned that Jacob retreated into work when he was worried, that he needed to feel useful and capable. 6 weeks after the accident, Dr. Wright pronounced Jacob healed enough to return to light work. The day he finally rode out with Pete to check the north fence line, Georgiana stood on the porch watching them go and realized with startling clarity that she wasn't planning her exit anymore. She wasn't thinking about saving money to move on. She was thinking about winter in Caldwell, about Christmas with Jacob, about spring when school would let out and she'd have more time to spend at the ranch. She was thinking about staying. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming up for air after being underwater too long. That evening, when Jacob returned tired but satisfied from his first real day of work, she met him at the door with a kiss that made him pull her close despite his dusty clothes. "What was that for?" he asked, smiling against her lips, "For being patient with me, for waiting while I figured out I wanted to stay." His eyes lit up. "You're staying, really staying, really staying." She took his hand. "I'm not running anymore, Jacob. Caldwell is home now. You're home now." The joy on his face was worth every moment of fear she'd overcome to get here. He pulled her into another kiss, deeper this time, full of promise and relief and the beginning of something neither of them had thought they'd find again. "Marry me," he said when they finally broke apart. Georgiana laughed, giddy with happiness and possibility. "That wasn't much of a proposal. You're right." Jacob took both her hands, suddenly serious despite the smile tugging at his lips. "Georgiana Elsworth, you came into my life when I'd convinced myself I was content being alone. You showed me that existing isn't living, that walls might keep out pain but they also keep out joy. You're brave and stubborn and beautiful, and you see through my nonsense in a way that keeps me honest. I'm asking you to make this ranch our ranch, this life our life. Will you marry me?" She should have hesitated, should have asked for time to think, should have protected herself from the terrifying leap of faith marriage represented. Instead, she found herself saying yes before her caution could catch up. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Jacob let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the nearby corral and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around before his still healing ribs protested, and he had to set her down again. They were both laughing, both a little teary, both amazed that they'd somehow found each other in this vast, lonely prairie. "When?" Jacob asked, still holding her close. "Soon." Georgiana surprised herself with the certainty. "I don't need a big wedding or months of planning. I just need you and a preacher and the promise that we'll figure out the rest as we go." "That can definitely be arranged." Jacob kissed her again, softer this time. "How about next month? Give folks time to adjust to the idea, have a proper celebration." "Martha would never forgive us if we eloped without letting her organize something." Georgiana laughed. picturing Martha's face if they denied her the chance to coordinate a wedding. Next month sounds perfect. They were married on the first Saturday of November, in the little white church where they'd first seen each other at that Sunday service back in July. The whole town turned out, packing the pews, curious and mostly supportive despite some whispered concerns about the speed of the courtship. Georgiana wore a dress she'd made herself, cream-colored wool with lace at the collar that Martha had insisted on contributing. Jacob wore his Sunday best, his hair neatly trimmed, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the aisle. Reverend Cooper performed the ceremony, his voice warm with genuine happiness for them both. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed her with a tenderness that made several women in the congregation sigh audibly. The reception was held at the town hall, with tables of food contributed by what seemed like every family in Caldwell. There was music and dancing and toasts that made them both laugh and tear up. Pete got quietly drunk and told anyone who'd listened that he'd known all along, that the boss had needed a good woman to settle him. Martha hugged Georgiana tight and whispered that she'd known the moment she saw them together that they were meant to be. As the sun set and the party continued, Jacob pulled Georgiana outside for a moment of quiet. They stood on the steps of the town hall, looking out at Caldwell spread before them in the twilight. "No regrets?" Jacob asked, his arm around her waist. "None." And Georgiana meant it. For the first time in 3 years, she felt anchored, rooted home. "You?" "Not a single one." He kissed her temple. "Thank you for taking a chance on a broken-down rancher with more cattle than sense. Thank you for being patient with a woman who'd forgotten how to stay still." She turned in his arms to face him properly. "I love you, Jacob Vance. I should have said it before, but I was scared. I'm not scared anymore. I love you too, Georgiana Vance." He tested out her new name with obvious pleasure. "Ready to go home?" Home. The Double V Ranch, which was now her ranch too. The house she'd helped prepare for winter, hanging curtains she'd sewn herself, arranging furniture to accommodate 2 lives instead of 1. The bedroom she'd only entered to help Jacob when he was injured, which would now be their bedroom, their shared space. "I'm ready," she said. They said their goodbyes and thank yous, accepting congratulations and well wishes, then climbed into the wagon Jacob had driven into town. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them wrapped in the significance of the day, the promises they'd made, the life stretching ahead. At the house, Jacob carried her over the threshold despite her protests about his ribs, which had healed but still bothered him sometimes. Inside, someone, probably Pete, had lit lamps throughout the house and started a fire in the fireplace. It was warm and welcoming, a home waiting for them. Their wedding night was tender and patient, Jacob showing Georgiana with touches and whispered words how much he loved her, how grateful he was that she'd chosen him, chosen them. For Georgiana, it was a revelation, this physical intimacy that came wrapped in emotional connection and trust. This was what she'd been missing, what she'd been running from. Not just love, but the courage to be vulnerable enough to receive it. Afterward, lying in Jacob's arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Georgiana felt tears slide down her cheeks. But these weren't tears of grief or fear. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of coming home after being lost for so long. "What's wrong?" Jacob's voice rumbled under her ear, concerned. "Nothing. Everything's right. For the first time in so long, everything is exactly right." His arms tightened around her. "It's going to stay right, too. I promise you that. We're building something lasting here, Georgiana, something that can weather whatever storms come." She believed him. More importantly, she believed in them, in the strength they'd found together, in the way their brokenness had somehow made them stronger when they joined the pieces together. The first winter of their marriage was hard in the way Kansas winters are, with winds that cut through layers of wool and snow that buried fences and made travel treacherous. Georgiana continued teaching through it all, now riding back and forth between the ranch and school with Jacob, or one of the hands accompanying her when the weather was particularly bad. She discovered that being married didn't feel constraining the way she'd feared. Instead, it felt like having a partner, someone to share both burdens and joys. When a blizzard knocked out part of the barn roof, she worked alongside the hands to repair it, her teaching muscles learning new kinds of strength. When she struggled with a particularly difficult student, Jacob helped her think through approaches, offering the patience he'd learned from working with skittish horses. They celebrated their first Christmas together with a small party for the ranch hands, Pete and the others crowding into the house for a meal Georgiana had worked days to prepare. She'd made a shirt for Jacob, painstakingly stitching it during stolen moments when he was out working. He'd made her a bookshelf for the bedroom, beautifully crafted from wood he'd been saving for a special project. In February, when the winter seemed endless and even Georgiana's optimism was flagging, Jacob came home with news that one of the neighboring ranchers was selling out and moving back east. His spread borders ours to the west, Jacob explained over dinner. Good grazing land, a creek that runs year-round. If we could buy it, we'd nearly double our range. Do we have the money? Georgiana had taken over managing the ranch books, her Philadelphia education finally proving useful in ways her father would never have imagined. Not quite. We'd need to take out a loan, use this year's profits as collateral. Jacob looked uncertain. I know debt makes you nervous after what happened with your father. It did make her nervous. The word debt still had the power to make her stomach clench. But she'd also learned, living with Jacob, that there was a difference between reckless borrowing and smart investment. Show me the numbers, she said. They spent the next week going over finances, projecting income, calculating risks. The loan would be significant, but the land was worth it. With the increased range, they could expand the herd, maybe start the horse breeding program Jacob had talked about. It was a risk, but a calculated one. Let's do it, Georgiana said finally. Let's buy the land. Jacob looked at her with something like awe. You're sure? I don't want you to feel pressured. I'm sure. This is our ranch, our future. I trust your judgment and I trust us to make it work. The purchase went through in March, and suddenly the Double V was one of the largest ranches in the county. It meant more work, necessitated hiring 2 additional hands, required long days of fence building and planning. But it also meant security, meant building something that could support not just them, but the family they'd started tentatively discussing. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the prairie overnight into a sea of wildflowers and new grass. The cattle fattened on the rich grazing, calves were born healthy and strong, and the ranch buzzed with productive energy. In May, as the school year wound down, Georgiana realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another week, afraid to hope, before finally confiding in Martha. Could be any number of things, Martha said practically, but her eyes were knowing. But if I were you, I'd talk to Dr. Wright. The doctor confirmed what Georgiana had barely let herself believe. She was pregnant, about 2 months along by his estimation, the baby due in late December or early January. Georgiana walked back to the school in a daze, her hand pressed against her still flat stomach, her heart a confused tangle of joy and terror. A baby. She was going to have a baby. She and Jacob were going to be parents. She tried to imagine it and couldn't quite. Tried to picture Jacob holding an infant with those work-roughened hands. Tried to see herself as a mother. responsible for a tiny life. The fear that something would go wrong, that she'd lose this the way Jacob had lost his daughter, rose up sharp and choking. But underneath, the fear was something else. Hope. Desperate, fragile hope that this time would be different, that this baby would live and thrive and fill their house with noise and joy. She told Jacob that evening after dinner, when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of orange and pink. "I went to see Dr. Wright today," she said, her voice not quite steady. Jacob turned to her immediately, concern crossing his face. "Are you all right? Are you sick?" "No, I'm not sick." She took his hand, placed it on her stomach. "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." The expression that crossed Jacob's face was complicated, cycling through shock, joy, and then fear so raw it hurt to witness. His hand trembled against her stomach. "A baby," he whispered. "Georgiana, are you sure? Is the doctor sure?" "He's sure. About 2 months along. Due around the new year." Jacob pulled his hand back as if burned, standing abruptly and moving to the porch rail. His shoulders were tense, his breathing harsh. Georgiana's heart sank, though she understood. Of course he was scared. Of course the memory of Mary and their daughter would rear up at this news. "Jacob," she said softly, moving to stand beside him. "Talk to me. Tell me what you're thinking." "I'm thinking I'm terrified," he said roughly. "I'm thinking I can't lose you. I can't go through that again, Georgiana. I won't survive it. You won't have to." She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "I'm strong and I'm healthy, and Dr. Wright is a good doctor. I know you're scared, but we can't let fear steal our joy. This baby is a gift, Jacob, a chance to build the family we both want. What if something goes wrong? What if everything goes right?" She pressed her forehead to his. "We could spend the next 7 months being terrified, or we could spend them being grateful and excited and preparing. I need you to choose hope with me, Jacob. Can you do that?" She felt the moment he made the decision, felt the tension drain from his shoulders as he wrapped his arms around her. "Yes," he said against her hair. "Yes, I can do that. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm happy, Georgiana. I'm scared out of my mind, but I'm happy." "Me too," she admitted. "On both counts." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the fading light, two people who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the choice to move forward despite it. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Jacob fussed over Georgiana like she was made of glass. She finished out the school year, then handed the reins over to a new teacher the town had hired for the fall. She'd planned to return to teaching after the baby was born, but as her body changed and grew, as she felt the first fluttering movements of the baby inside her, she realized she wanted this time, wanted to focus on becoming a mother without dividing her attention. "We can afford it," Jacob assured her when she worried about the lost income. "The ranch is doing well. You take the time you need." Summer passed in a golden haze of preparation. They converted one of the upstairs bedrooms into a nursery, Jacob building a cradle with his own hands, Georgiana sewing tiny clothes and blankets. The ranch hands threw them a party in July to celebrate, everyone contributing something for the baby. As fall arrived and Georgiana grew larger, more uncomfortable, she spent more time at the house while Jacob worked. She cooked and sewed and read, occasionally helping with ranch paperwork when her energy allowed. Dr. Wright checked on her regularly, pronouncing her and the baby healthy. Winter came early that year, November bringing snow and cold that kept everyone close to home. Georgiana's due date came and went with no sign of the baby, then another week, then 2. She was enormous, uncomfortable, and increasingly anxious that something was wrong. "First babies are often late," Dr. Wright reassured her during one of his check-ins. "Everything sounds good. The baby's heartbeat is strong. Be patient." On a Tuesday evening in mid-January 1885, as a snowstorm raged outside and Jacob was helping Pete winterize the barn, Georgiana felt the first contraction. It was unmistakable, a tightening across her belly that took her breath away. She stood from the chair where she'd been knitting, suddenly afraid. This was it. This was really happening when Jacob came in an hour later, stomping snow from his boots. He found her pacing the kitchen, breathing through contractions that were coming every 10 minutes. "It's time," she said, and watched his face go pale. "I'll get the doctor." He started to head back out, but she caught his arm. "Not yet. Dr. Wright said early labor could last hours, even a day for first babies. Let's wait until the contractions are closer together." "Are you sure?" "What if we wait too long? What if Jacob?" She cupped his face, seeing the panic in his eyes. "Breathe. I need you calm right now, all right? I need you to be strong for me." He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, visibly pulling himself together. When he opened them again, the panic was still there but controlled. Okay, I'm here. What do you need? Just you. And maybe help me walk. Movement is supposed to help." They spent the next several hours pacing the house, Jacob supporting Georgiana through contractions that gradually grew stronger and closer together. He talked to her constantly, telling stories, reminding her to breathe, stroking her hair when the pain made her lean into him. Around midnight, when the contractions were 5 minutes apart and strong enough to double her over, Jacob went for the doctor. He was back within an hour, Dr. Wright and Martha Henderson both with him. "Martha's assisted at more births than I can count," the doctor explained as he set up his supplies. "And I thought you might want another woman present." Georgiana could have cried with gratitude. As the labor intensified, as the pain became something she'd never imagined, Martha's calm presence and practical advice were invaluable. She showed Jacob how to support Georgiana, what to say, when to step back and let the doctor work. The labor was long and difficult, pushing on into the dawn and then the morning. There were moments when Georgiana was sure she couldn't do it, couldn't survive this, when the pain was so overwhelming she understood how women died in childbirth. But Jacob was there through all of it, never leaving her side, his hand strong in hers, his voice steady even when she could see the fear in his eyes. "You can do this," he kept saying. "You're the strongest person I know. You can do this." And finally, after 16 hours of labor, as the winter sun climbed toward noon, the baby came. A boy, red-faced and howling, absolutely perfect. "You have a son," Dr. Wright said, placing the baby on Georgiana's chest. "A healthy, beautiful son." Georgiana looked down at the tiny, angry face and felt something slot into place in her chest, something she hadn't known was missing. This was her son, hers and Jacob's. This was family, rooted and real and permanent. She looked up at Jacob, who was staring at the baby with tears streaming down his face, and felt her own tears fall. "We have a son," she whispered. Jacob carefully touched the baby's tiny hand, wonder transforming his face when the miniature fingers wrapped around his calloused one. "He's perfect." "You're perfect. I can't believe, Georgiana, we have a son. What should we name him?" She'd thought about names for months, but now, looking at this specific baby, most of them didn't feel right. "What about William?" Jacob suggested. "After your father," Georgiana felt her breath catch. Despite everything, despite the debts and the deception, her father had loved her. She knew that. "William Jacob Vance," she said, testing it out. "That sounds right." "William Jacob Vance," Jacob repeated, his voice thick with emotion. He kissed Georgiana's forehead, then carefully, reverently, kissed his son's head. "Welcome home, William. We've been waiting for you." Dr. Wright and Martha stayed for another few hours, making sure both Georgiana and the baby were stable and healthy. Martha showed them how to nurse, how to hold the baby, all the practical skills they'd need. Finally, satisfied that all was well, they left the new family alone. Georgiana lay in bed with William sleeping on her chest. Jacob curled beside them with his arm around both of them, and felt a peace she'd never known before. This was what she'd been running from, she realized. Not pain or loss, but this overwhelming sense of permanence, of stakes so high that losing them would destroy her. But she wasn't running anymore. She was anchored here by love and choice and this tiny person who depended on them completely. "Thank you," Jacob said softly. For him, for staying, for making me believe in family again. "Thank you for being worth staying for," Georgiana answered. "For showing me that putting down roots doesn't mean being trapped, it means growing." They drifted in and out of sleep through the afternoon and evening, waking to tend to William, to marvel at his tiny features, to adjust to the reality that they were parents now, that their family had expanded in the most profound way possible. Over the next weeks and months, they learned the rhythm of life with an infant. The exhaustion, the constant care, the way time became measured in feedings and diaper changes, and brief snatches of sleep. But also the joy, the moments when William would focus his eyes on their faces and seem to recognize them, when his crying would stop the moment Jacob picked him up, when he'd nurse and fall asleep heavy and content in Georgiana's arms. Spring came again, and with it the endless work of the ranch. Jacob hired another hand to help pick up the slack while he spent more time at the house, wanting to be present for William's early months. Georgiana learned to balance motherhood with the 1,000 other tasks of running a household and helping manage the ranch. They were tired and stretched thin, but they were happy in a deep, solid way that had nothing to do with circumstance and everything to do with who they'd chosen to become. On William's first birthday, they threw a party at the ranch. It seemed like half the county showed up, families from town and surrounding ranches, all wanting to celebrate with them. The house was full of noise and laughter and life. Georgiana stood on the porch at one point, taking a brief break from hosting, and looked out at the scene before her. William was being passed between admiring women. Jacob was showing some of the men a new colt he was particularly proud of. Children ran shrieking through the yard, playing games in the last light of the January day. This was her life now. This place, these people, this family. She'd stopped running and found everything she'd been running from turned out to be everything she needed. Martha joined her on the porch, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She passed one to Georgiana with a knowing smile. "You look happy," the older woman observed. "I am. Happier than I knew was possible." Georgiana sipped the coffee, savoring the warmth. "I spent 3 years convinced that staying in one place would suffocate me. Turns out I just hadn't found the right place yet, or the right person to stay with. That too." Georgiana watched Jacob, who had William in his arms now, pointing out the horses to their son who was too young to understand but babbled happily anyway. "I used to think stability meant being trapped. Now I realize it means being free enough to grow." "You two have built something special here," Martha said. "The Double V isn't just a ranch anymore. It's a home, a real home, the kind that lasts." As if sensing her attention, Jacob looked up and caught Georgiana's eye. The smile he gave her was full of love and contentment and promise. She smiled back, her heart full to bursting. Later that night, after everyone had left and William was asleep in his cradle, Georgiana and Jacob sat in front of the fire like they had so many times before. But everything was different now. They weren't 2 lonely people trying to figure out how to stop running. They were a family, anchored and rooted in home. "You ever miss it?" Jacob asked, his arm around her shoulders. "The excitement of new places, the possibility of starting fresh somewhere else." Georgiana thought about it honestly. Sometimes, but not the way I used to. Now when I think about traveling, I think about taking William to see things when he's older, coming back here afterward. This is my anchor now, Jacob. You and William and this ranch. I'm not going anywhere. Good. He kissed her temple. Because I'm planning on spending the next 50 years with you at least. Think you can handle that? 50 years of waking up next to you, raising our children, building this life. I think I can handle that just fine. Children, Jacob picked up on the plural. You thinking about more, maybe, eventually, when William's a bit older. She turned to look at him. Would you want more with you, as many as we're blessed with? His hand found her stomach, the gesture familiar now, full of possibility. You've given me so much, Georgiana. A second chance at love, at family, at happiness. I want to fill this house with our children, our grandchildren someday. I want to build something that lasts long after we're gone. Then that's what we'll do. She leaned into him, feeling the solidity of his presence, the warmth of his love. Together. Outside, the Kansas wind blew across the prairie like it always had, eternal and endless. But inside the house at the Double V Ranch, a different kind of permanence had taken root. The kind built on love and choice and courage. The kind that turned two people running from their pasts into a family building toward their future. Georgiana had spent 3 years whispering to herself that she'd never feel anchored, never find a place to call home. But Jacob Vance, with his steady hands and understanding eyes, had become her anchor in the storm. And in doing so, he'd helped her realize that anchors didn't trap you in place. They gave you the stability to weather any storm, the security to grow deep roots, the freedom to become who you were always meant to be. She'd finally stopped running. And in stopping, she'd found everything she'd been looking for all along. The years that followed were full in the way good lives are. William grew from a baby into a curious toddler, then an energetic boy who loved the ranch and followed his father everywhere, learning to ride almost before he could walk properly. When he was 3, Georgiana gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Sarah, who turned the house into a chaos of dresses and dolls and endless energy. Jacob expanded the horse breeding program, the Double V becoming known throughout Kansas for quality stock. Georgiana, when the children were old enough, returned to teaching part-time, working with students who needed extra help, finding that she could balance motherhood and her love of education in ways she'd never imagined. The ranch prospered through good years and survived the hard ones, the latter made bearable by the foundation of love and partnership Jacob and Georgiana had built. They fought sometimes, as all couples do, but they'd learned to talk through their conflicts, to remember that they were on the same side, building the same life. On their 10th anniversary, Jacob gave Georgiana a letter he'd written but never sent, from those early days when she was staying at the ranch while he recovered from his injuries. I wrote this the night you agreed to try, to give us a chance, he explained as she unfolded the worn paper. I wanted to remember how it felt, that moment when I realized I might not have to be alone anymore. The letter was simple but profound, expressing his gratitude for her presence, his hope that she'd stay, his conviction that together they could build something lasting. Georgiana read it with tears in her eyes, remembering that younger version of herself who'd been so afraid to stop running. I'm glad I stayed, she whispered. I'm glad you were patient enough to wait for me to figure out that staying was what I wanted. I would have waited forever, Jacob said, pulling her close. You were worth waiting for. Their children grew, each unique, each loved. William became a rancher like his father, eventually taking over more of the daily operations as Jacob and Georgiana grew older. Emma married a teacher and moved to Wichita, where she opened a school for girls. Sarah became a veterinarian, one of the first women in Kansas to do so, and stayed in Caldwell to tend to the animals she'd loved since childhood. Through it all, through decades of life lived fully, Jacob and Georgiana remained anchored to each other. They grew old together on the ranch they'd built, watching their grandchildren play in the same yards where their children had played, seeing the Double V transform from a lonely rancher's dream into a family legacy. On an autumn evening 53 years after Georgiana had first arrived in Caldwell with a single carpet bag and a habit of running, she and Jacob sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold. They were old now, their bodies worn from decades of hard work and good living, but their hands were still intertwined, their love still as solid as the day they'd spoken their vows. No regrets. Jacob asked the same question he'd asked her on their wedding day, on their 10th anniversary, on countless quiet evenings over the decades. Not a single one, Georgiana answered, the same answer she always gave, meaning it more with each passing year. You. Only that I didn't meet you sooner. He squeezed her hand. But I'm grateful for every year we've had. Me too. She leaned her head on his shoulder, as comfortable with him now as she was with her own skin. Thank you for being my anchor, Jacob, for helping me learn that putting down roots doesn't mean losing yourself. It means finding yourself. Thank you for letting me be that for you, for teaching me that moving on from loss doesn't mean forgetting it. It means honoring it by building something new. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon. Two people who'd started as lonely strangers and become each other's home. The wind whispered across the prairie, carrying with it the sound of cattle lowing, children's laughter from the house where Sarah was visiting with her family, the everyday music of a life well lived. Georgiana had spent 3 years running from the idea of home before she found it here, in this place, with this man. She'd whispered to herself that she'd never feel anchored, never find peace in staying still. But Jacob had become her anchor in every storm, and together they'd built something that would last long after they were gone. The Double V Ranch, their children and grandchildren, the love that had started in broken places and grown strong enough to weather any storm. This was their legacy. This was their happy ending. This was proof that sometimes the thing you spend your whole life running from turns out to be exactly what you needed all along. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the vast Kansas sky, Jacob and Georgiana Vance headed inside their home, together as they'd been for more than half a century, anchored to each other and to the life they'd chosen to build. And if that wasn't a happily ever after, then such a thing had never existed.